The Relationship Between Lying and Truth by Allison Lee and Marie Armas. In our psychology class, our teacher wanted to demonstrate a particular concept by replicating the Solomon-Asch conformity experiment or the line test. Here, a question would be asked, and we and our classmates would purposely give the same wrong answer. The participant answered last, and we predicted that they would give the same answer as everyone else. So our teacher called in a random person walking past our classroom and asked if he could answer a question. But we knew that the student would be doing more than this. He was also participating in an experiment. Reflecting on this experience now, I can see that there's much more to be considered about whether or not this act was ethical. I experienced the feeling of guilt at the time because I knew that this person was being tricked by us, and this suggests that this action was not ethical. According to Immanuel Kant's system of categorical imperative, where only intentions matter, because I knew that the student did not know anything, I was acting immorally. On the other hand, a utilitarian perspective would suggest that it was justified. Our experiment was harmless, the participant was fine with what we did when he was informed of the experiment afterwards, and we received data from this act that was relevant to the theory we were testing. I think that most people would agree that an unimpactful lie like this is not something to lose sleep over, but it does exemplify a dilemma more prominent in other experiments. In some cases, the actions of experimenters present more of a debate about whether or not said actions are ethical. For example, participants who consent to experiments but are unaware of possible dangers in traumatic situations, or experiments on animals or children, all bring up questionable ethics, as full consent cannot be given, and when analyzing this through a more utilitarian perspective, the pros and cons are more even. But it's also important to note if lying in these situations are necessary. In other words, can certain psychology experiments be conducted without lying or withholding truth? In our real-life situation, the answer would be no. Not telling the random student that he would be participating in an experiment gives more conclusive data, since he would be giving his true reaction rather than altering his actions to make himself look better. And even if certain actions are unethical, the information gained from the experiment still provides insights and valuable knowledge to the human sciences. However, this is only one example in the realm of psychology, and the question must be asked, is knowledge still considered true if lying or withholding truth is involved? In the human sciences, specifically psychology, truth is determined by a claim's evidence supporting it and a wide applicability to its situations, and lying can come from the experimenter or the participant. Our real-life situation dealt with when an experimenter lies in order to protect the validity of an experiment. And obviously, when an experimenter messes with the data, the conclusions drawn from it would be invalid and the knowledge produced would be untrue. On the other hand, it would seem as though if a participant lies in an experiment, the conclusions gathered from this data would not be true, as it doesn't really reflect people's real behavior. For example, the use of surveys to gather information can be a valuable tool for examining large groups of people in a short amount of time. But one of the shortcomings of this method is that there's no real way to fact check the answers, especially if the survey is anonymous. I once participated in a survey investigating the mental health of teenagers, and several of the questions were rather personal, asking if I've ever felt depressed or if school has ever given me an unhealthy amount of stress. I didn't feel comfortable disclosing that information, even though the survey was anonymous, so I lied and answered that I was completely happy. Because I wanted to avoid feeling sad for the rest of the day, I did not answer truthfully. Listening to my emotions and wanting to stay away from negative feelings had caused me to lie about my answers. And lying on some of these answers would obviously invalidate the findings of this investigation, as it would not truly reflect the mental health of teenagers. The experimenter places their faith that the participants will tell the truth, and especially since the survey was anonymous, they have no idea if the answers are accurate or not and are forced to take people's word for it. Therefore, if participants are expected to tell the truth, knowledge would not be considered true if a participant lies. However, if the experiment is testing to see if a participant will lie or not, then the conclusions from that experiment can still be considered valid. For example, going back to the experiment that was replicated in a psychology class, Ash was testing to see if people would conform to what the majority of people had to say. In his control group consisting of all participants, only less than 1% of the answers given were wrong. So it's assumed that when the so it's assumed that the participants from the critical trials are aware of the right answers. Yet when 75% of those participating in the critical trials gave the wrong answer at least once, Ash would know that they were lying and only gave the wrong answer to conform to the group. Again, participants use their emotions to influence their decisions to answer dishonestly. Because they would feel uncomfortable being the only person to choose a different answer, they chose to side with the group even if it meant they were wrong. However, in the case the experimenter had a lack of faith in the participants and anticipated that they would lie, however, in this case, because lying was accounted for from the participants, Ash was able to come to a truthful conclusion. So when the experimenter is aware that people are lying, knowledge can be considered true. And if a participant lies in their answers or hides their true feelings, it is important to note if the experimenter is aware of it. If left in the dark, this false data will lead them to a conclusion that is untrue, since it does not have data supporting it and because it does not actually apply to human behavior. However, the experiments that deal with certain concepts, such as conformity, deal with why people lie and thus account for this behavior in their conclusions.
When discussing this topic in regards to the arts, it is crucial to define the term lying, as an author cannot directly lie about their artwork. This is because lying is typically defined as disclosing the wrong information. Rather, lying is alternatively defined as withholding truth within the realms of the arts. For instance, a creator of art may not be forthcoming with the information within their work. This is to preserve the author's insight for a greater cause. However, this does not affect the validity of the artwork, because valid artwork is ultimately defined as the ability of an observer to define what the stimulus means in regards to themselves or their society. Though this may seem counterintuitive, there is a method to the madness. Authors ultimately withhold information from their audience to allow for the connections to be made on a more personal level to enhance the effects of the message, a message that is trying to be conveyed throughout the art form. The ability to develop personal interpretations of a piece of artwork inevitably establish knowledge of their own that draws upon connections between the art form and the observer. For instance, in literature, authors employ allusions and figurative language to convey a message throughout the story without giving great insight into the specifics of the novel, such as Animal Farm. In George Orwell's Animal Farm, he highlights the corruption that communism imposes on society through the use of allusion, imagery, and word choice. Throughout the novel, George Orwell does not deliberately disclose the topic of the novel in order for the reader to draw upon context clues to come up with this knowledge on their own. For example, in Chapter 10 of Animal Farm, George Orwell writes, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." Upon first glance, it seems as if the reader is talking strictly about animals. However, it is up to the reader themselves to draw upon the conclusion that the author is making reference to something much greater. However, once a reader dives deeper into the text as a whole, this quote can be identified as reference to the corruption of communism that the pigs in the Animal Farm represent. This conclusion could ultimately be determined by using context clues from other instances in the novel in which the reader may have particularly observed. Throughout the implications of language, the author is capable of distributing valid knowledge for the reader to obtain without deliberately stating the true meanings of their work. The author makes reference and allusions to the communists that the reader can draw upon. In conclusion, this is inevitably done to establish a greater connection to the meaning of the work as a whole by the reader. Because if an author were to be deliberate about the meaning of the novel, it would weaken the impact that the message on a reader. By doing so, the author employs faith in that their audience is capable of drawing upon conclusions that were specifically designed in the production of their literature. In this case, when a reader draws upon conclusions based off their findings in a novel, the validity of their findings can be deemed true or accurate even when information is withheld by the author. This is because an author can deliberately withhold information so that their audience engages in the novel to produce knowledge of their own. This knowledge is ultimately based off their reasoning and intuition gathered from making decisions about the novel's topic from analyzing pieces of text. In hindsight, this knowledge becomes more valid than others because the art is deliberately made to engage a reader in the form in which the author created it. Within the creation of poetry, poets also reap the benefits of not disclosing the true meaning of their art. Though this may leave us confused and frustrated, it is ultimately done to once again engage the audience in developing their own comprehension that is true to themselves. For example, my class and I studied poet Derek Walcott in order to prepare for IB exams. Our teacher proposed concepts about the poem that were once foreign to our ears. However, after time of deliberation, more conclusions about the poem were discussed that could not be confirmed nor denied. The ability to develop multiple ideas about a single artwork can be attributed to the subjectivity of the arts. This subjectivity ultimately allows for the production of knowledge to be composed of a variety of interpretations. Some may argue that there is an overall purpose to art and that there is in fact no such thing as subjectivity within the arts. However, poets such as Walcott writes deliberately about a single topic while employing different ideas through word choice and imagery. For example, in line 41 of chapter 13 of Homerus, Walcott writes that his father instructs him to do just that labor which marries your heart to your right hand. In my class, we came up with 3 interpretations. The first one being right hand, suggesting that Walcott's father is instructing his son to literally write Homerus with his right hand rather than his left. A second interpretation that we developed was that right hand could also imply the idea of writing, as in W-R-I-T-E or W-R-I-T-I-N-G, because after all, he is an author and he must write a poem in order for him to share it with the rest of the world. And the last interpretation that we came up with was that Walcott's father was enticing his son to write Homerus with the right hand, emphasis on doing it with the right intentions. Authors such as Walcott inevitably withhold the specific details about their work to allow for readers' own interpretation to be developed based off the context of the work as a whole. When interpretations are left to be determined by the reader, the production of knowledge expands and it is not confined to the predetermined definitions that. When definitions are attached by an author, it constrains the meaning of a poem, closing it off to different interpretations. However, the withholding of truth allows for a reader to develop their own interpretations that become valid to themselves. This is because an individual may use definitions of their own by attaching associations in which they have predetermined from other experiences. An interpretation that can later be shared to produce more knowledge about the work as a whole and stimulating more growth in this area of knowledge. Therefore, it can be argued that withholding truth is better than revealing the author's intended message. The establishment of knowledge that is true to an individual ultimately employs aspects of emotion and imagination which create a personal connection to the work as a whole. This personal engagement is inevitably what some authors seek in the presentation of their own work. This is because, in some circumstances, the success of art can partially be attributed to the engagement of an individual, therefore making the work valid not only to an individual, but to the community as a whole. After our exploration, we have come to the conclusion that knowledge can indeed be defined as valid even if truth is withheld or lying, or if lying is involved. With respect to our real-life situation, the realms in which the human sciences lie allow for us to deceive the random student while gathering legitimate knowledge. While this experiment may have been considered as unethical by some, the knowledge obtained from the experiment could not have been acquired any other way. An experiment's morality does not affect whether the knowledge itself is true, and in some cases, lines have been crossed to further investigate ideas in the human sciences. Rather, lies are able to affect the truth of knowledge depending on if the experiment has accounted for this behavior. When faith is put into a participant that they will tell the truth, their lies will affect the outcome of the experiment in a negative way. However, if there is a lack of faith, the participant will be honest, then the experimenter can account for this behavior. Due to the need for experimentation in the human sciences, the result of lying can be insignificant. Ultimately, the results from our experiment conducted in our psychology class yielded conclusions that would better our understanding of this area of knowledge, conclusions that contribute to the understanding of society as a whole. Therefore, the knowledge that was produced in our in-class experiment is justifiable and remains valid through lying, though lying was used as an aid to obtain results for our experimentation.